Hi. I'll have you know in advance that I'm as disappointed by this talk as you will be. This same thing always happens. I put 10 times the work into one of these things that I really ought to, and it's about a tenth of what I would like. So now you know, expectations on zero. All right, I guess everybody doesn't know who I am. So that's who I am. That is a complete statement. There is not much more to be said because that bonfire there is my life over the last 5 years. Odersky keeps a nice even flame over 10, and I'm more of a burnout and go home, which in fact I have in some sense, which is why I get to give a talk called We're Doing It All Wrong, because in principle I'm not the one doing it all wrong anymore. I don't know if that's the case or not, but we'll see. So to understand the things that I say, you have to know that it's somewhat emotional for me because I have invested a huge chunk of my life, certainly like the most productive years of my life, in a manner of speaking, into the Scala implementation, and TypeSafe continues on without me. And they're all my friends over there, and since Scala's got a huge chunk of me in it, I'm rooting for these guys completely. So please don't infer anything from the things I say in this talk, which could perhaps be interpreted as critical and once in a while, given that they almost have to be because I quit over this stuff, right? So, there's no way to reconcile that. Criticism has to come out. So, anyway, I love them and I hope they do well, but I don't know if they will. So that's what's next. And, I'm going to go off and do something else, but of course I'm going to be writing it in Scala as a start. It's not like I have a better idea. So at the very least, I can endorse Scala relative to the set of existing alternatives pretty strongly, in some sense. But I judge things compared to what could be and not what is. So it's not good enough to be like, the strongest of the little kids brawling when you could be, like the big kid next door. And I just think we could do the whole enterprise way better. I have felt this for a while, and the feeling has become too strong to combat. So I would love to be able to say, here's the thing. I wanted to give you a silver bullet. Bad news, there is no silver bullet. And there's no one thing that is being done wrong. Oh, and I should clarify what I mean by we're doing it all wrong, because my experiences are largely informed by working on the Scala compiler implementation, which is not necessarily relevant to JRandom project using Scala, but it is in fact relevant. There's a bunch of overlap between the failures of design and the failures of programming practice that take place in the compiler, and how that manifests for you as a user of the compiler. These things sort of go hand in hand. So I think the people that use a language end up unconsciously modeling the people that make it. So if you have issues at one level, they're going to make themselves felt at the next level as well. Those are some good nutshell pictures. So when I proposed this talk, as usual, just trying to make something up to get somebody off my back so that I could go back to programming, pretty much the story of my life, I made up the title of this talk, and I had something very different in mind. But I definitely didn't think that I would find out that we're literally doing it all wrong. But that is kind of how it felt when I sat down to write everything down. So this talk, this is so incomplete. My list of issues with the way things are done in programming in general and in Scala in particular would fill this room with paper. So the more that it's like that, the more likely it is that I'm delusional and not actually useful to listen to. So I leave it in your hands. I'm just self-aware enough to know that I'm almost certainly crazy to think anything like that. But I do think that, in all honesty. So you have to assess. I can't assess. But I guess if there was one little sort of pithy aphorism I would throw out there, something that I've noticed repeatedly people don't consider when they think about I want thing X, why they don't have it or why it's hard. the Scala compiler is so ridiculously difficult to modify that you have to be a rocket scientist. You need a degree in rocket science, like printed, or you can't do it. The most trivial modification is a tremendous undertaking. Almost everybody fails. It's amazing the things that people do accomplish, but what they have to go through to do it is crazy. This holds Scala back more than anything. And so, I would say the biggest thing that we are doing wrong there, and I think a lot of people are doing wrong, is not holding modifiability in their heart as with the esteem that it needs to be. You cannot let your code base deteriorate in such a way that you can't modify it. If you can't change it, you can't fix it. If you can't move things around, it will ossify, and then you go off a cliff. And you can see it in the Scala compiler as well. There's this point when you're kind of holding stasis, and then you go off a cliff because it's gotten too big, too ball of mud. The ball of mud architecture has won, and now you're just trying to stave off your inevitable defeat. But I've never heard it put this way, about modifiability, because, well, for one thing, one of the interesting tensions that we always had there is that Martin is less keen on some modifications that I make than he is. Now, the way I see it, I'm making modifications so I don't have to modify it more, right? It's like I also appreciate the benefits of not modifying things. It's great, that's stability, but it has to be right? It's like if it's right, then we can not modify it, but you can't, not modifying it when it's wrong or difficult to work with is bad. So, these are the struggles of our lives. So this is another of my little aphorisms. If it isn't straightforward to modify, it will never be any good. I will stand by that one. So we go around and we use this language that can do a billion different things, and we use it for a billion different things. Most of the time, the thing that we're doing doesn't need 90% of the power that's before us. If I'm expressing relationships, if I'm saying this thing has this quality and this thing, I don't need it tied in with a bunch of initialization order stuff and whatnot. I mean, I'm making some logic-based, timeless assertions in a very simple, limited language. And yet, I take on every single thing that Scala could possibly do in order to do that. And now anybody who deals with me has to consider every single thing that Scala could possibly do. And this is just an explosion of unnecessary complexity. If you limit what you say, then you limit what you have to understand. And they go hand in hand. And then I have my favorite kind of mean, concrete example of this. It's mean because, it's inherited from Java, but so what? When we want to compare two things, we get a result and it's less than, equal to, or greater than. That's it. That's all that there is. We allow for no other possibility except throwing an exception. So we take those three possibilities and we encode them in 4.2 billion states. And we say, all right, let's just take this 4.2 billion states and we'll partition it. We'll say, first 2.1 billion means less than, 0 means equal, greater than 0, the other 2.1 billion means greater than. It's good, it's fine. It's essentially, it's a mapping onto whatever you call the ejection, it's insurjection or an injection, whatever, it's great, it's fine. It's not fine, but it's worse than that because now it's an int. It's not even like some nice specific 4.2 billion state thing that at least we can associate with the concept of a comparison. It's just regular int. So everything else that we use int for is exactly the same. So here we are using a language with types, and we've essentially just abandoned it completely. And so, maybe you can keep your comparison straight, maybe you can't, but it's this kind of thing in the aggregate that is devastating to correctness because you can't trust anything. I just got an int. What's that int mean? Well, I don't know. It might mean, the number of ducks there is in this bucket, or it might be less than, who knows? It might be failure to find an index. I don't know what it is. It's an int. So the reason that example is kind of mean, again, is that we had to do that because, Java. So I've spent the last 5 years nodding along with all manner of decisions that I was less than pleased with that were made on the basis of either performance, and I usually say it like this, performance or compatibility, and it's compatibility. The scare quotes, if they're not apparent, are there to tell you that it's used more as sort of like a appeal to amorphous authority in the air than it is it's not like I've got the numbers, it's for performance. It's like I don't want to deal with that. It's for performance. That's how it's going to be. And I'm pretty sure that the great majority of interesting compatibility can be achieved without the kinds of compromises that Scala has made. Certainly not the compromises to the integrity of the type system, where very easy things could have been done such that we wouldn't have universal equality running around all over the place, which is really devastating to type safe equality and whatnot. I mean, there's a lot of examples. Compatibility is something that you achieve by mediating the conversation between thing A and thing B. It's not something that you achieve by polluting the model of A so that it looks a little like B. You get the worst of both worlds that way. But this is mostly, in my opinion, what's been done in Scala. I'll just let you read that slide because this is me being funny. I wonder if there's enough people in here that are old enough to recognize the graphic. Yes? Who what's the graphic from? Lemmings. So not that we're lemmings, but it was the first thing that came to mind. The essential logic at work here is what it feels to me like, and the worst thing is that, we're doing it like Java does for Java's reasons, and then, we get one-upped by Java. That's when we really get burned. Like in Java 8, their views actually work. So, now we've actually been lapped by Java, and that's not cool. It's like we ought to be leading on that sort of thing, and we're not. So I hold a special place in my black heart for universal equality. I don't know, I'm not sure what the room is full of, whether we have lots of, I like monads types, or I started in Java. So, because you can get all kinds of receptions on this sort of thing, because people basically, they feel the pain of this sort of thing in different ways, all the way from, what are you talking about? It's great, and to, it's the devil. But anything that is designed into the core-based root object and that works on any's is essentially a complete abandonment of type safety. And it makes it does it in a way that's impossible to recover. And you could have a type safety in your core things and give it up, but you can't not have it and then make it appear out of thin air, except by abandoning and avoiding the operator. But because of the way equality is privileged in Scala, you can't avoid it. There's no way around it. You want to use the collections, you have to use it. You want to use a pattern matcher, you have to use it. So there's just, in my view, no good reason for making these kinds of decisions in a way that everybody is faced with them and nobody can improve on it. It should be the other way around. Opt out of type safety. Don't make people try to reconstruct it. So, yes, a capricious mistress. So, in hindsight, and I'm not going to claim that I was 100% on top of this going in at all, because there are a number of things where I've said, don't do it. And I feel like all those don't do it have been correct. This is not one. I didn't understand what a mistake this was. But if you're going to try to use inheritance to share implementation, you better be sure that there's something useful to be derived from doing so. It turns out that with mutable and immutable collections, you literally are in grave danger from the other implementation everywhere you look. So you must override methods. I would say that a good rule of thumb is if you feel you must override methods or your class is going to be wrong, then inheritance is probably the wrong tool. But that's very much the case in Scala collections, and many bugs have been just from letting a method fall through too far such that it gets caught by the mutable guy at the leaf, right? I mean, because it's not optional. The mutable class must not share little bits of itself into other things, but the immutable class must, or it's way too expensive. It's a performance bug just as much as the other is a correctness bug, but they're both bugs. So if that's going to be the case, if one or the other is always wrong, then it should be abstract. It should not be a thing where we define the implementation up here, override it to avoid it here, and let it fall through over here. There's no gain in that. There's just massive, intertwined complexity, which is exactly what we have, unfortunately. So in hindsight, there should be no shared code between mutable and immutable. There's some things you just can't abstract over, and this is one of them. But that's where it is, and it's just, there's no way to fix this kind of thing now. It's not that there's no way, inherently, there's no way against the forces of not changing things. And so there it is. So I like talking about tails and dogs for some reason. To me, it's always been the thing. It's oh, we can't do it that way. That would be too slow. Well, you know what's slow is spending all day trying to figure out why it doesn't work. That's slow. That's the slowest thing I know. However slow it is when it runs and gives the right answer, that's still pretty fast compared to which is a pretty typical day when the tail's wagging the dog. So if correctness is paramount interest, performance will come because you can see, right? If it's obviously correct, as opposed to there's many good quotes out there. One way is to make it have no obvious defects, and the other way is to make it with obviously no defects. This distinction is completely lost on beginning programmers. It's the most key distinction, right? It's not enough for it to be correct. It has to be clearly correct, visibly correct to the next guy. Right? If you program that way and you're actually able to maintain that over a decent-sized code base, the performance will come. You can't write it slow enough that it can't be optimized if you can see what it's doing, if you can modify it. But conversely, it's impossible to make it fast if nobody can modify it. And again, that's the Scala compiler will never be fast. It's just never going to happen. They'll pour they'll pour a bunch of lives into it. And there will be many tears and blood, but they'll never make it fast. Not without rewriting it. It'll never happen. It's just the way that it is. Because you can't make it fast, for one thing, without much greater concurrency stuff going on, right? I mean, and you can't bolt that kind of thing on after the fact. No matter, people are always yeah, I can do it. I don't know. In our company, or my ex-company, I guess, it's hard to speak in the right tense. TypeSafe should certainly know better. And I hope that they do on some level, know that you cannot bolt to something as crazily mutability everywhere, 10 years of sequential thinking. You cannot take a 200,000 line piece of software along those lines and say, all right, we'll just make some adjustments and it'll be running in parallel. It's never going to happen. They can't even get reflection to be thread safe. I mean, there's after lots and lots of work, it's maybe, who knows, maybe they'll get there, but that's just the tip of the iceberg. That's my little clever channeling Ben Franklin. Those who would give up correctness for a little temporary performance deserve neither correctness nor performance. Yeah. So this is a really good example of the problems that come with not having restraint. If you can do whatever you want, then we have to assume you're going to do whatever you want, which means we can optimize nothing. Filter on an immutable collection, you ought to be able to return the original collection if nothing changed. That's an obvious optimization. But because filter's defined as returns a new collection with the stuff that meets the test, and you can actually see the difference with reference equality, then we don't know if they don't have a condition on the next line saying, well, if the return value, who knows what they're doing with it. But one way or another, it's easy for things to break in the face of, I tested this for reference equality, and now it's not reference equality anymore, or it was. So the upshot is you just got to allocate until the cows come home, even on these obviously true situations. And there are many examples of this where it's impossible to optimize because the semantics aren't locked down. We've presented all these mechanisms for inspection after the fact and no way to limit them. And so you just basically have to say, all right, so it's an endless list. Things like fusion. If I've got a collection and I do map, flat map, filter, group by, Now, I wrote a macro at some point that would just take an expression like that and fuse all the expressions into one, and you get this massive speed improvement, right? If it's like filter, 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 I'll just make it one filter and it's 3 times faster, literally. And yet can't do it because who knows what side effects might be hidden in the filter functions. Don't know. And so you're out. Well, you can if you get out in front of that sort of thing and just define it that way, you can't have side effects in your filter functions, then you get this huge opportunity, but you've got to do it. So Scala hasn't done that, and is very, like, the hands are tied behind the back and they've been thrown over the side with the concrete shoes. It's very difficult to optimize. So maybe they'll get there with very painful, massive purity analysis, et cetera, but that's just making it too hard. There's lots of people out there very willing to program in a particular way so that it's easy for you, the compiler writer, to optimize, but you've got to give them a way to do it. If you give them no way to do it, then everybody loses. So in Paul P. fictional language, which might not be fictional forever, reference equality is not something you would have by default. I don't want you making that inspection. And if you're going to do it, you're going to have to declare that you're doing it so that I can see that you're doing it. And everybody else, I will assume is not doing it because they won't have any operator to do it with. Another in the, if Java jumped off a bridge, what would you do? Is the semantics of silent coercion between primitives. That's int.max value. Now, I think I could come up with a long list of things where int.max value actually makes a difference to subtract from something, right, to some billion. But not here. There's no warnings. There's nothing. That's just something Scala will happily do. Same thing, long, whatever, shave off 32 bits, whatever, it's equal. We're in a happy, floaty world. There's no way out of this. It's not enough that it exists at all. You can't get out. You can't even opt out. I'll never get used to this sort of thing, right? It's I don't care whether nobody uses floats, whatever. I just don't want obviously wrong things at the core of the language I'm using. That just drives me nuts. I would hope that anybody that thought correctness was an interesting value worth pursuing would feel similarly. I always get this scream guy into my talks. I don't think he's, but that's a perfect depiction of me in my office. So the picture is supposed to make you think you can go really fast and still lose. The greatest performance improvement of all is when a system goes from not working to working, a movement I have experienced less frequently than I would like. And the third one is not very veiled sort of description of Scala C, because again, it's there remain these periodic, stepwise jumps in performance taking place in the compiler. It's not because, we got the next Einstein just was born. It's because somebody finally stared through the noise long enough to see the obvious thing that we're doing that's blasting away tons of performance. I think there's probably a factor of 10 lying around. It's that bad, even now, even having myself sunk hundreds of hours into profiling the compiler. But it is so hard to pinpoint what's doing what and why, and it's impossible to modify. So again, it's the same thing. You can't make it fast if you can't change it. So it would be easy to quibble with any particular example in here, well, some more so than others. But it's the aggregate effect that I'm after, in that, have you ever seen anybody who went out to excel at some activity, some, golfer or whatever, have you ever seen them neglect the fundamentals in the pursuit of whatever it is that the high-level guys do? You will not see anybody like that. They all are masters of the fundamentals, and they remain masters of the fundamentals. And only when they are confident in their ongoing mastery of the fundamentals do they work on the things that you build on the fundamentals. That's how you get good at things. These things are like fundamentals that you're not good at. And yet, there we are out there, like at the leading edge of type nuttiness and macro land and all kinds of stuff. You can't build on that. And so you end up with this terrible feedback loop of like your own flaws are grabbing at you from below, and they make everything more complicated on the way up as you have to work around those flaws. Your workarounds start duplicating across your code base and competing with each other. I mean, it is literally like you have to unravel the maze of workarounds to get back to what started out as a small thing, but because it was sitting there under everything, it has had far-reaching effects. It's just not the way to do it. You have to get the fundamentals correct. You know, there's a process, there's an order. And really, if anybody here knows anything about like airplanes, please don't go like, yeah, it's just like that. I mean, it's like I've got to fly from place to place, and that's the last thing I need. To know that like even like anybody that I self-identified as a professional programmer was involved would terrify me. It's like I want to hear only like civil engineers that have been converted and retrained. I mean, I genuinely think we're terrible at it as a profession. Like, it's shameful. And I include myself in that. So there's no such thing as a general purpose. And if I didn't mention it before, my slides are not going to win any awards for, like, this might end up at the end a little bit like one of those cartoons where you got to reorder, like, to make it make sense. So it's like I put a ton of time into it, and yet it's never enough. And so, I don't know, this probably was designed to come a little bit earlier. But the examples at the bottom are good examples. Do you really want is it really the same language that you're speaking when you make a statement like, take this register and increment the value of this register in place, which is like, basically, you know, we're talking load accumulator type, like move EAX, versus this type is, you know, going to conform to this type in some abstract universe with no time, state, or place. It's like just a sort of a eternal law that I'm stating for the purposes of, these are like the opposite extremes by a million miles. If you are putting those things anywhere near each other, you're doing it wrong, let me tell you. But whatever you're doing the one, you've got the other right there. And it doesn't matter if like you use it, it's the possibility exists at all times. It's not the same language. It's not the same task. It's not the same set of things that you want to express. And so you end up jack of all trades and master of none. So this is more to belabor the same idea, but I don't mind belaboring because you're a captive audience. Everything that, like, whatever your tools are for talking, the other side has got to have the tools for listening. Whatever it is that you can do, the other side's got to be able to make sense of what it is that you can do. And there's a really unfortunate thing in that each new way of talking that you get becomes like geometrically a burden on the listener, because they've got to consider you. So let's say there's 100 ways for you to express something. You go out and you're like, I'm just going to pick that one, and that's how I'm going to talk, and it'll be nice and easy. But they've got to all, consider all things at all times, and who knows what kinds of interactions. So that's like for them, it's this, this barrage of possibility. Even though you're only carving out a little space, and it seems reasonable to you in your little space, from the other side, it's this crazy huge universe. You have to limit the size of the possibility universe. You can't just limit the size of what you use. So this is where one looks at Scala and says, well, there's an awful lot going on, and especially it's going on at all times. There's no reasonable subset. Like, I only use maybe half the language. I want to be able to only use that half and then reap the benefits of only using that half because they are significant. But I can only do that in a very limited way myself. I want to be able to do that with other people, right? It's like the real thing is to be able to reuse other people's code, something we're so terrible at. It's so hard, and we make it harder. So yes, it's another little aphorism which is probably ambitious in this case. But unnecessary expressiveness is the enemy. I stress it because it is such a natural thing to think more power is better, and like I'm sure we've all heard on sort of like on a rational basis that's not true, and probably know on a rational basis that's not true. But intuitively, it's very likely we don't accept it. We're like, yeah, more power. I could do stuff, right? Because you think about doing stuff, and you don't think about being on the receiving end of it, or especially just being on the receiving end of the possibility of it. But that's where all the victims are. Those are the silent evidence. The bodies, the battlefield's full of bodies. It's all the things not done because it was too complicated because of all the stuff you could have done, if that makes any sense. So the real power, and this is all like Zen master, no, the real power is in not having the power. But it's true, right? It is through restriction that we gain power. It is through the less that we can do, the more that we can do with what we did. The less that we can do, the more that we can optimize, which is very important for encouraging like the right kind of programming. If half the reason we do all this bad stuff is for performance, well, if we could, properly optimize immutable, nice code, there wouldn't be that kind of gap. But we can't. We're hamstrung on that point. So we end up, all right, well, here we go. Var I equals 1. Let's do it's sick. It's crazy. It's 2013. There is no way we should ever have an index I and be going like in a loop, I equals I plus 1. It's nuts. That should have been retired 50 years ago. It's crazy. Like the compiler can't do that? It's very upsetting, as you can see. Really, it's like that's what I mean when I say that we're terrible as a profession, because it's sick. It's sick that like new kids I'm teaching a class at my daughter's school, and it's like they don't have an enormous amount of like programming expertise, and they go to Code Academy, whatever, and it's like the first thing they're teaching them. So here we go with like a loop and an I counter. Like, why is this the first thing we're teaching them? This is like the worst thing to put into their heads. Teach them just, something that's completely without values. Just, like map anything. The limits of my language are the limits of my world. So I carry that with me all the time, because what you cannot say, you cannot depend upon. To have a language at the top that was much smaller than Scala. See, we already use this hodgepodge of languages, right? When, you've got like your Ant build with your crazy XM, like the worst possible language at the top, XML, and then your series of other languages on the way down, God knows. But almost certainly you have a hodgepodge of like Shell, XML, Java, and Scala. Like even a little project, it's easy to walk into having at least those 4, and maybe a bunch more. So in some sense, you're already doing this. But what if there was like a more of a designed situation, right? You have a language essentially that contracts at the top to high level concepts, doesn't have a means for expressing time or state. It only has a means for expressing what you want to express, which is the relationship between large abstract entities. And that's it. And then as you go down, you gain the power to express more things. But now you're as the listener, you get to deal with less. It makes a big difference. Separation of concerns enforced by construction. By construction. These are like my favorite 2 words, because the compiler's full of these places where it's like, well, here we go. Let's try to, handle this situation. No. You just created it. You don't need to go back and then try to make sure you did it right. Excuse me. You can just create it right in the first place. You can do it by construction. I have a very recent commit, if you're interested in reading code, that rewrites the pickler, which is the serialization of trees to disk that takes place, to use the regular tree traversers. And there's a page of code that is essentially visually, you look at it and it's correct. You can't help it because of the way that it happens. It just rolls out in order and it's done. There's the trees. It's a perfect example. I really like it. I should have a slide of the difference between like obviously no defects and no obvious defects, which is what it had before. So all these layers. So reality being what it is. Let me just see what time it is. Ooh, later than I thought. Anybody want to give me a hint how long I actually get to talk when? I'll time things a little, because
Maybe another 5-10 minutes.
Okay. All right, because I don't want to spend the entire time slagging off Scala, because I do have a little bit on like what I think we ought to do. So I might have to fast forward. I'm going to fast forward a little bit so that I don't not get to that. So here we go. La, la, la. These slides will be online if you really are interested. Now here's a little joke that I can't help because I really liked it when I thought of it. So those were like 3 little things that I sort of thought of as, guiding principles, and they're not catchy enough, so I was trying to come up with a catchier expression, and then that works a lot better. Because it does work, right? Ignorance is strength is especially good, because that is what a non-leaky abstraction is. You can be ignorant, and therefore you are strong because you don't have to worry about what's inside the abstraction. It's true. And freedom is slavery. If there's total freedom of action, you are enslaved by all the possibilities of things you have to handle. I mean, it's completely prophetic. So, and that's why the thing about anyway, war is peace is the layer boundaries. Like if we will fight our wars at the boundaries so that we can have peace internally. So there are 2 guys from whom I draw inspiration, and it's funny because they would like totally have come to blows, the 2 of them. One of them is Dijkstra here, and this really captures so much of what the compiler should be and isn't, as a series of machines that are genuinely written in terms of abstractions that only exist because you wrote them. If more stuff was written like this, we would be so much better off. And it can be like that, right? If you have a large-ish system, then what you have are little blobs of logic that are operating in terms of some internal logic. The underlying levers are things that you write, but if you have to isolate it, segregate it, do not allow for it to reach through and do a bunch of crazy, that's a this. You make it its own thing and enforce it, and you actually have a separate component, something that is like plausibly modular, but you must be ruthless about it. You can't fake this stuff. It's got to be, enforced by construction, not enforced by the rule is generally we don't call from point A to point B. That's not going to do it. Nobody's good enough to do that, and nobody will. All right, so in the very brief time I have remaining, I will give you a complete picture of my plan for the next 25 years. So, programming language misses the point as far as I'm concerned. I don't need a programming language. I need a set of tools that help me make software. A programming language is something I will need sometimes, but not even that often. I want to programmatically generate ASTs and feed those. And I want to be able to basically pick and choose exactly how I'm going to do stuff, whether it's going to be with text, with some kind of tree form, or something even later in the pipeline. But basically, I want really well-defined entry points into a series of things with really well-defined languages, something that is very much not offered by our tremendously entangled compiler, which doesn't even have a clean parse tree. It's comical. Try to get back to the source code from what you get out of the Scala parser, and it's crazily far from what you started with. That, to me, the minimum test of a parser is that it parses. But it parses and then does a bunch of desugaring, which is really difficult to unravel. And it makes it impossible to tell the difference between a for comprehension and a call to map. You can't even tell them apart by the time you get the parse tree. And that's not a parse tree, that's a parse tree, and then I had some fun with it, we played football. Why, and if you think about it, even though this is what everybody does, it's kind of nuts. Why is the canonical representation of code a string? Isn't that string is the universal data type that we throw everything into and bury? String is not a good basis for things, for anything, right? It just happens to be the thing that we edit. The code that you look at, that ought to be a reflection of the actual AST. The canonical thing ought to be the tree, right? The code is a view of it. And one effect you have of that is that the language becomes unimportant. You could actually have, if you don't like curly braces, whatever, great, doesn't matter, right? Because you're just looking at a view of an AST, but it's the AST that's important. This would also allow us to define things far more tightly than they are presently defined. It's the AST behavior that matters. It's not, you don't have to worry about like exactly what's expressible in surface syntax and work out all these syntactic collisions that we have. People can make their own decisions about that. The language of interoperation ought to be a tree. It's trees that are fundamental. That's what we work with. So I've got this whole vision. It's pretty cool. It'll take a while to implement. But so there's got to be a VM that's running much closer to you than the JVM. There's just no way that you can deal with all the crap that is the JVM and have a good experience. I want something that is interpreting exactly the language that I'm writing. So I'm going to feed it AST. Whatever the AST is going to be designed alongside the VM so that the VM is designed to interpret the AST. It'll be interpreting exactly what you wrote, not something a bunch further down the road, right? Exactly what you wrote. And from this, we can get like instant feedback really fast, right? We have all the time in the world to compile down to bytecode. That's like machine code. That's somebody else's problem. I need a tight feedback loop on the thing I'm working on right now. And so there is a lot of opportunity there. This thing in green, that was going to be the basis of the whole talk. And instead, it just became this one line in green. But you got to design the language and the VM and everything around change, around diff as being the fundamental entry, right? We go back to the beginning, you change one letter in one file, and we go back to the beginning and parse 200,000 lines of code, reparse everything to get back to where you were. Why? Everything that we just did was already valid, and all we had to do was change one letter. We have no means to do it. But all day long, you sit there, you edit code. You're not changing 1,000 things at once, you're changing one. Everything should be designed so that that one change can come in and do its work. This would also have the benefit that we would know a lot more about what the impact of a change is, something that we are very ignorant of right now. So I want that to be like the fundamental design principles. It's all like, it's the first derivative of what we do right now. And okay, let me get to my guys at the end here. I'm going to skip all this. You can look at it online. So if you want to see some of what I'm talking about, if you haven't already, this guy is fantastic. That's his site, and he's got a talk on there, like the one talk, if you're going to watch one thing, called Inventing on Principle. And if you watch that, and if you haven't seen it before, you don't come out of that going like, that guy's talking about some stuff that's good, then you're crazy. And then you've surely heard of this gentleman who has much to say about our flailing and must be rolling over, all day long in his grave. But, he's all of these quotes from the 60s that remain exactly as vital, if not more so. Here's one. The programmers themselves are responsible and nobody else. And that's the case. But we can do better, and I hope that we will. Thank you for your attention. So I guess I used up all my time for sure, but I'll be around the next 2 days with no plan. So if you want to know anything, feel free.
There's 5 minutes for questions.
Oh, all right. Then 5 minutes for questions.
So macros and reflection have opened up this world for day-to-day programmers to see how the compiler.
Yeah. I begged them not to just export the compiler to. I begged them not to do it.
Okay, my question was, how much is that going to hurt future changes to the compiler as far as compatibility?
The sort of surprise is that because of the light that was shined on the incredibly terrible code, it has gotten way better. And so it's hard to say that it was a mistake in that sense. Now, anybody who has attempted to use macros or whatever has been the victims on the altar of that. But it had a tremendously beneficial effect on the compiler. Now, it's amazing how good that effect was and how bad it still is. It's like you have to keep readjusting your estimate of the distance to goodness. But so it's hard to say. Nothing's ever going to be stable anywhere near where it is now. I think the whole reflection library should be thrown out, etc. But just the fact that anything has any chance of working is big progress. I don't know if that's at all the least bit helpful. Yes.
So when will O'Reilly be publishing your book, Scala: The Good Part?
Yeah, the good part's right. Well, I've actually thought of
It's going to be a wrapper around one of the closure books.
No, I still have enthusiasm for enough Scala that I could write Scala: The Good Parts. I would like to actually, because I just know so much about what's a bad idea. But yeah, I don't know. I don't get enough time to program as it is. It's hard for me to think about writing books, but it's a good idea. Yes.
I keep thinking lately that the next sort of era of programming will be when your average programmer is sort of qualified to write their own language. That's completely.
Well, we must have reached that point, if I think.
But I mean, it's not the sort of thing that most programmers can even like fiddle with. Like, oh, I can just go write even just a parser.
Well, it doesn't even reach the level of something to consider. Right. It's not even on the radar. That's like, they talk about like maybe 10 years from now we're teaching programming like reading and writing. You do that, then nobody gets out of school without having written a compiler. Now we can enter the era where that happens, but I think it's a ways off, quite a ways.
It's not a question but a comment. For me, the main benefit of macros is that it puts a very sharp, almost total end to the cascade of attention deficit grad students. Language features are now stopped before they have a chance of getting to the compiler. And it's only a macro. It's okay. Right. They can't fuck anything up too quickly.
Well, I'm not sure that was the optimal way to get there, but I agree that the cascade of attention deficit grad students was a good thing to put to staunch. Yes.
You looked at Jeopardy's MPS at all, their metaprogramming system?
Yeah, I mean, I've looked at it enough to know what you're talking about, and every time I'd like try to, basically it's like the activation energy is too high. Even though it seems to be really good, it's still too high. It's got to be lower. Like the one thing I know in the absolute core of my heart is that it must require absolutely no investment of energy or commitment or anything, or nobody will ever look at it. And I assume that is what's happened with MPS. I don't actually know. I have no patience for IDEs, so I'm the wrong guy to ask. But I mean, I like the idea, and I think it's kind of Turing tar pit in the way that it plays out. In that, I don't need that level of generality. What I need is a really opinionated set of tools designed to work together in the way that I describe, which is different than MPS, if you catch my drift. Yes.
Have you looked at any of these sort of Matryoshka doll languages where you have a very small core, but then the language has levels? Because Daira Hopwood, I think at Strange Loop Emerging Languages this year, presented on a language that had 10 or 12 levels. It starts with something purely functional, very small, and then it just gets bigger and bigger and bigger and adds in concurrency and this, that, the other, and finally mutation and stuff at the very outwards.
Well, I will want to pick your brain on that point, because I know that in the functional programming world, this is going to super tempting, and the Turing tar pit again beckons, right? If you actually implement in this way, and you're whatever you do, if you're 9 layers away from doing an addition, then it's going to be a problem. So it's you have to make very tasteful compromises, and maybe that's where the art is going to lie. I'm not sure, but I would love to see what's been done. Yes, is your question? Yeah, no. Oh, is that question? All right, yes?
Well, so you make up a lot of other points, but a lot of this is fighting with a giant code base with a few people. It sounds like, if Scala is commercially successful, I'm just wondering how many of these problems can be overcome with a lot of smart people with a lot of money. If you hire a lot of excellent developers, the code base can be rewritten from scratch.
Yeah, but it can't, though. So the thing it can't because of the language and the installed base. Basically, there are 1,000 points within the implementation that people depend on that nobody knows what they are. When you change it and it breaks them, that's when you find out what they are. If you set out to rewrite it, you would break all 1,000 of them. Without knowing what it is that your code does and what it is that because the implementation is the specification. Anybody who's followed my struggles knows the specification has been the big deal to me for years, and it really is the straw on the back is that I cannot get anything, we have no specification essentially. It's useless. And yeah, there's just no way. You have to get there incrementally. So you're really doomed. If you could rewrite it, that would be something. Now, clearly, think of old 8086, how long they were able to drag life out of that by throwing a lot of smart people at it. Clearly, great things can be done. But TypeSafe has a compiler team of 3 people. It was 4, and when I quit, they didn't replace me. So it's 3. And JSON is 10. Which is not to minimize the other guys, but if you don't have Jason, you're dead. Because you need a guy like Jason or like me who's so sick that they will chase this ridiculous this ridiculous thing for days to finally find out how it is that it could act like that. And I don't know, like, you have half as many of those guys as you did, and if Jason ever says, like, I'm giving this up, you better find another one. And I don't know where you find another one. Oh, all right, that's cool. Again, I'll be around, so feel free to ask me anywhere, anytime.